It was March 28th, 1757 in Paris, and a profound silence fell over the Place de Grève. Tens of thousands of people filled every available space, climbing onto rooftops, clinging to windows, and even perching on chimneys. Nobles had paid exorbitant prices for balcony seats to witness the horrifying spectacle that was about to unfold, the most elaborate and terrifying execution in French history. At the heart of the square, a wooden platform had been erected, surrounded by soldiers struggling to maintain order amidst the palpable tension. The crowd buzzed with whispers about the condemned man and his extraordinary crime. He was a simple servant who had dared to raise his hand against the sacred body of the king, and now he would face the most terrible punishment the French state had ever devised. A cart rumbled into the square, carrying Robert-François Damiens, a 42-year-old domestic servant. After months of torture in the Bastille dungeons, he was pale and almost unrecognizable. His crime was the attack on King Louis XV with a small pocketknife, which had only inflicted a superficial wound. His motive remains a mystery, but the French crown was determined to use an unprecedented display of brutality to eliminate any doubts about its authority. As Damiens was bound to the scaffold, rumors circulated through the crowd. One woman whispered that he was possessed, while another suggested he was influenced by seditious philosophers. A third voice claimed he had mental problems. The whispers ceased as the executioner appeared with his terrifying instruments. To understand how Damiens reached this fatal moment, one must look back years to when he was an invisible, humble servant among the hundreds who served the French nobility. Born in January 1715 in Latil, a small village in northern France, Damiens was the son of a gatekeeper. His destiny seemed to be a life of anonymous servitude from the very beginning. As a young man, he worked for various aristocratic families, earning a contradictory reputation for having an unstable temper, which often cost him jobs, but also for periods of devoted service. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man of unpredictable behavior and variable moods. Damiens held positions in several noble homes and, for short periods, even at Versailles Palace, where he could closely observe French court life. His career path was erratic. He would often abandon his positions abruptly or be dismissed for insubordination. Those who knew him mentioned his tendency to engage in passionate conversations about religion and politics, which were dangerous topics in a France where the monarch's absolute authority was directly linked to divine order. The political and social climate of Louis XV's France is crucial to understanding Damiens' act. It was a time of rising tensions. Louis XV's reign, which had begun with popular enthusiasm and earned him the nickname Beloved, had significantly deteriorated. Military defeats during the 7 Years' War, increased taxes, and the perception of a monarch more interested in personal pleasures than state affairs fueled widespread discontent. At the same time, a fierce ideological battle divided France. On one side, Enlightenment philosophers boldly questioned the foundations of absolute monarchy, while on the other, the Catholic Church and Jansenist parliamentarians waged their own disputes with the crown. Seditious pamphlets circulated in Paris, openly criticizing the king and his official mistress, Madame de Pompadour. It was in this atmosphere of dissatisfaction that Damiens, an seemingly ordinary man, committed an extraordinary act on the cold afternoon of January 5, 1757. King Louis XV was getting out of his carriage at Versailles Palace after visiting his sick daughter. Wrapped in multiple layers of clothing against the cold, the king barely noticed when a man approached from behind and stabbed him between the ribs with a small blade. The wound was superficial, more of a cut than a deep puncture. Louis XV initially thought he had just been jostled until he saw blood on his hand. He ordered, "I am stabbed. Stop that man, but do not kill him," fearing the blade might be poisoned, a concern that was quickly disproved. Damiens made no attempt to run away. He stood motionless, seemingly resigned, when the guard seized him, simply saying, "Let no one touch the king. I have something to tell him." Exactly what he wanted to tell Louis XV remains one of the case's many unanswered questions. During his interrogations, Damiens gave contradictory explanations. He sometimes suggested religious motives linked to Jansenist conflicts, while at other times he spoke vaguely about the kingdom's poor administration and the people's suffering. He insisted, "If I had wanted to kill the king, I would have killed him," suggesting his act was more of a symbolic protest than an assassination attempt. The French authorities, determined to uncover a larger conspiracy, subjected Damiens to brutal tortures in the hope of extracting the names of accomplices. However, nearly 2 months of interrogations under torture produced no evidence of a conspiracy. Damiens appeared to have acted alone, possibly influenced by seditious conversations heard in Parisian taverns and the houses where he had worked. The possibility that a simple servant could, on his own, attack the sacred body of the king was perhaps more terrifying to the French court than any conspiracy. It represented a fundamental breach in the social structure that upheld the Ancien Régime, the belief that the monarch was untouchable, divinely appointed, and absolutely superior to his subjects. The trial that followed was a mere formality. The Parliament of Paris, despite its frequent conflicts with Louis XV on other matters, did not hesitate to condemn Damiens to the punishment reserved for regicides, even though the king had barely been injured. The sentence, pronounced on March 26, 1757, detailed with clinical precision each stage of the torture he would endure before death. And so, we return to that March morning on the Place de Grève. Damiens, more dead than alive after months of torture, was bound to a platform. The executioner, Henri Sanson, a man whose profession had been passed down through several generations of his family, approached with red-hot pincers. What followed was so horrific that even the impassive chronicler Casanova, who witnessed the execution, later wrote, "I returned home sick and feverish." The execution stages were meticulously followed according to the sentence. First, Damiens' right hand, the one that had held the knife against the king, was burned with flaming sulfur. Then, pieces of his flesh were torn off with red-hot pincers from his chest, arms, thighs, and calves, the places where he would be dismembered. Molten lead, boiling oil, wax, and sulfur were poured into the open wounds. The crowd, which had come to be entertained by human suffering, began to faint by the thousands. Even veteran soldiers looked away. The final stage was the quartering. 4 strong horses were attached to Damiens' limbs and driven in opposite directions. However, the human body is surprisingly resilient. After half an hour of effort, Damiens' limbs had still not separated from his torso. Horrified whispers swept through the crowd, with some seeing it as a divine sign that the punishment exceeded even God's justice. The executioner, embarrassed by this setback, asked for permission from the magistrates present to make incisions at Damiens' shoulders and hips with a knife to facilitate the horse's work. Permission was granted, and finally, after nearly an hour of indescribable torment, Damiens' body was torn apart. His remains were immediately burned and the ashes were scattered to the wind, a final attempt to erase not only his physical existence, but also the memory of his defiance of royal authority. However, Damiens' death had the opposite effect of what the French crown intended. Instead of reaffirming the monarch's absolute power, it exposed its fundamental fragility. The spectacle of state brutality was seared into the French collective memory. Voltaire, Diderot, and other Enlightenment philosophers cited the case as an example of the Ancien Régime's barbarity. In the decades that followed, as the discontent that would lead to the French Revolution fermented, Damiens's execution was frequently mentioned in revolutionary pamphlets. Louis XV survived the attack for 18 more years, but his popularity never recovered. The beloved became an object of public contempt, and the Damiens episode only intensified criticisms of his reign, which was considered decadent. When he died in 1774, few French people mourned his passing. Curiously, Damiens's execution was the last of its kind in French history. The growing influence of the Enlightenment was already changing public sensibilities regarding excessively cruel punishments. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, just 32 years later, another French monarch, Louis XVI, would face execution. But his death by guillotine would be quick, almost merciful in comparison. The revolution, despite all its violence, never replicated the methodical savagery that the Ancien Régime had reserved for Robert-François Damiens. 200 years later, philosopher Michel Foucault would begin his influential work, Discipline and Punish, with a detailed description of Damiens' execution. For Foucault, this public spectacle of punishment represented not only the brutality of a bygone era, but a fundamentally different manifestation of state power. It was a power that operated through the public demonstration of force on the bodies of the condemned, in contrast to modern systems of surveillance and discipline that control through more subtle and psychological means. What makes Damiens' story so deeply troubling is not just the horror of his punishment, but the enigma of his motivation. Historians continue to debate whether he was a religious fanatic, a precursor to revolution, a mentally disturbed man, or simply an ordinary servant who, in a moment of despair or impulse, crossed an invisible and sacred line, defying the established order of an entire society. Whatever the truth about his motivations, Damiens' execution remains one of the most brutal episodes in European judicial history. It was a moment when the state demonstrated all its vindictive power against an individual who dared to question, however momentarily and unsuccessfully, the inviolability of the royal body. His public dismemberment marks the culmination and, ironically, the beginning of the end of an era when the king's body was considered sacred, and any aggression toward it, no matter how minimal, deserved the most spectacular and terrible retribution.